In the winter of 1884, in Montana's Bitterroot Mountains, snow wasn't a visitor. It was a tyrant. It choked the trails, silenced the world, and buried every living thing under a blanket of suffocating white. And in that frozen kingdom, Jedediah Jed Thorne was a ghost. At 47, Jed didn't live. He merely occupied space. His cabin, a dark knot of timber wedged between pines bowed low with snow, wasn't a home. It was a fortress, a defense against the world, and worse, against his own memory. He had come here to disappear, to let the unforgiving wilderness scour him clean. Years in a blue uniform had taught him things a man should never know, and his hands, scarred and calloused, were made for taking life, not nurturing it. Every frozen dawn that broke across the jagged peaks was just another reminder of the emptiness, a self-imposed penance for sins he could never outrun, a silent tally of the men he'd left behind and the parts of himself he'd buried with them. But on that particular morning, destiny, or something colder, had a different plan. He was riding his steady-gaited horse, Buster, through a forest where the quiet was as deep as a grave. The only sounds were the crunch of hooves on packed snow and the rasp of his own breathing, a cloud of white in the biting air. Then, something broke the monotony, a smudge of wrongness against the stark landscape. It was a color that didn't belong. Down by the creek, where the water ran black and sluggish against the encroaching ice, a hand reached up from beneath a thin, crystalline sheet. It was pale, almost translucent, its fingers slightly curled, as if in a final, unheard prayer. Most men would have spurred their horse on. They would have seen it, squinted, and decided it was a trick of the light, a strangely shaped root, anything but what it was. Getting involved in these mountains was a fool's errand. Trouble in these parts had a way of ending in blood, and a wise man minded his own business, kept his head down, and lived to see another sunrise. Jed had spent the last decade being that wise man. He had turned his back on the world, asked nothing of it, and offered nothing in return. His solitude was a vow, a pact he had made with the ghosts that followed him. But something primal stirred in Jed, a reflex buried deeper than wisdom or fear. It wasn't pity. He'd had that beaten out of him long ago. It was recognition. In that desperate, frozen gesture, he saw an echo of the despair that clawed at the edges of his own soul every single night. He saw a surrender he understood all too well. Without a word, he dismounted. His breath froze in the air. He didn't hesitate. He stepped into the creek, and the cold was a physical blow, a blade of ice that shot straight through his leather trousers to the bone, stealing the air from his lungs. It was a pain that made him feel alive. He brought his bare fists down on the ice, the sharp crack echoing in the dead stillness of the woods. He ignored the sting as shards sliced into his knuckles. He reached into the numbing water and closed his hand around a wrist, no thicker than a branch. With a grunt that tore from his chest, he dragged a limp, impossibly light body to the shore. It was a girl, a native girl, no older than 19. Her long black hair was matted to a face drained of all color, a canvas of pale alabaster. Her deerskin clothes were torn, her moccasins gone. Her eyes were closed, fringed by lashes dusted with frost. He checked for a pulse, his own rough fingers pressing against her throat, and felt a flutter, faint and erratic as a trapped bird's wing. She wasn't drowning. She was freezing, the life being stolen from her, one slow, icy beat at a time. Jed didn't know her name was Ilara. He didn't know she was running from a forced marriage to a cruel man named Silas Blackwood, a man who saw her as property, a token to be owned. He didn't know the hand beneath the ice was the final act of a broken soul, a choice she'd made to embrace the river's cold mercy rather than a life of brutal servitude. He knew nothing of her story, her fears, or the hunters who were even now tracking her. He knew only one thing, a truth that burned through the cold and the solitude and the years of running away. He would not let her die here. He had seen enough death to last 100 lifetimes. He would not stand by and add one more ghost to the legion that haunted him. Lifting her weightless form into his arms, he turned back toward his cabin. The girl's head lolled against his shoulder, a fragile weight against the hard muscle of a man built for war. He was carrying a stranger back to his fortress of solitude, with no idea that in this single defiant act he wasn't just saving her, he was beginning to save himself. If you're enjoying this story, comment number 1 down below and hit that subscribe button. Help us reach our goal of 1,000 subscribers and encourage us to keep bringing you these powerful Wild West tales. You won't want to miss what happens when this girl wakes up inside the monster's den. Inside the cabin, the only sound was the spit and crackle of the fire in the hearth. It was a living thing in a room full of ghosts, its hungry flames casting long, dancing shadows that writhed on the rough-hewn log walls. Jed laid the girl on his cot, the one piece of furniture that held any semblance of comfort. The movement was clumsy, his motions stiff and unpracticed in the art of tenderness. These were the hands that had held a rifle through countless nights, that had dug graves in frozen earth, that had learned to make a fist faster than they could offer a kindness. Now, they fumbled with the hem of a wool blanket, their purpose uncertain. He worked with the clinical detachment of a field medic, peeling away the sodden, icy layers of her deerskin dress. The wet leather clung to her skin, cold and unforgiving. His gaze was fixed, deliberate, focused only on the task at hand, a self-imposed blindness to anything but the immediate necessity. This was not about her nakedness, a fact he ruthlessly pushed from his mind. It was about the cold, an enemy he understood intimately. To leave her in wet clothes was a death sentence, plain and simple. He worked quickly, his face a mask of stone, betraying nothing of the storm that was beginning to brew behind his eyes. Once she was wrapped in his thickest wool blanket, a coarse, grey shield against the encroaching chill, he stepped back. He put distance between them, a gulf of several feet that felt more like a mile, a chasm of culture, history and blood. He settled into the hard-backed wooden chair opposite the cot, the one he spent most of his nights in, staring into the flames as if searching for an answer they couldn't provide. His Winchester rifle leaned against the wall next to him, close enough to be an extension of his own arm. It was as much a part of him as the scars on his knuckles, a silent companion that asked for nothing and promised only a final, brutal certainty. The silence in the cabin grew, pressing in from all sides, heavy and absolute, thick with unspoken questions. But in the quiet of his own mind, a war had broken out. It was a silent, brutal conflict, fought on the familiar, scarred ground of his soul. The soldier in him, the pragmatist that had kept him breathing when other men fell, spoke first. Its voice was cold, logical, and sharp as a shard of ice. Trouble. You just dragged trouble over your own threshold. Look at her. This is how it starts. The soldier's voice wasn't just a feeling. It was a reel of vivid, blood-soaked memories. It was the memory of a quiet patrol shattered by a single arrow from the trees, the face of the young private who fell beside him, surprise frozen in his eyes. It was the memory of a seemingly abandoned village that erupted into an ambush. A native girl, alone. She's bait, or she's a stray. Either way, she's not your concern. The words were a litany of warnings, a catechism of survival learned at a terrible price. Someone is looking for her. That much is certain. Her people will come, maybe angry, maybe seeking vengeance for some imagined slight. Or her enemies will. White men, maybe. Men who won't take kindly to finding you with her. Either way, they will come here. This place, this sanctuary you built to keep the world out, you just invited it in through the front door. The soldier's logic was flawless, honed by years of mistrust. The smart play was to cut his losses. When she woke, when she could walk, he should point her toward the smoke of her own people or to the nearest fort. Give her some jerky and send her on her way. Let them sort it out. That was the safe play, the play that let him live to see another winter. To turn your back was to survive. He had learned that lesson in the mud and the blood, had seen the price paid by men who let their hearts rule their heads. But then another voice answered. It was a quieter voice, one he had tried to silence for a decade, burying it under layers of solitude and hard liquor. It was the voice of the man he used to be, or perhaps the man he'd never had the chance to become. It wasn't pity. Pity was a weakness he couldn't afford. This was something rawer, a deeper ache. He looked at the girl on his cot, at the sharp line of her cheekbones and the blue tint of cold still clinging to her lips. In the flickering firelight, her face was peaceful, all the fight washed out of it by exhaustion. And he didn't see an Indian. He didn't see a stranger or a threat. He saw a child. He saw a fragility that this harsh, unforgiving land was designed to crush. A flash of memory, unwanted and unwelcome, seared across his mind. A burning village under a pale, indifferent sky. The faces of women and children caught in the crossfire of a war they never asked for. He remembered their eyes, wide with a terror he could do nothing about. He'd followed his orders. He'd kept marching. He'd done his duty. And he'd been collecting ghosts ever since. He looked at the girl again. Was he really going to add her to the collection? Was he going to send her back out into the teeth of the storm, back to whatever horrors she was fleeing, just to buy himself a little more time? The thought settled in his gut like a lead weight. Turning her out wouldn't just be a practical decision, it would be a verdict. It would be the final confirmation that the man named Jedediah Thorne was truly dead, and only the soldier remained, a hollowed-out shell going through the motions of being alive. As if hearing the turmoil in his mind, the girl began to tremble. A low whimper escaped her lips, a sound of pure terror as some unseen demon chased her through her dreams. She was fighting a battle of her own, lost in the dark wilderness of memory. That small sound, so utterly vulnerable, broke the standoff in his soul. It was no longer a philosophical debate. It was no longer about the past or the future. It was about now. It was about the child, shivering on his cot. Jed stood, his chair scraping against the rough-hewn floorboards. The soldier fell silent, defeated not by argument, but by the undeniable reality of a human being in need. He moved to the small cast-iron stove, his actions mechanical and sure. He ladled a thin, clear broth from a pot that was always simmering, a tasteless but nourishing brew of smoked meat and wild roots. It was sustenance, nothing more. He didn't know how to care for the sick, not really. He didn't have a gentle touch or soothing words, but he knew how to keep a soldier on his feet through a long march. He knew the simple, brutal calculus of warmth and sustenance. He placed the steaming mug on the small crate beside the cot, a silent offering, a gesture that felt more significant than any prayer he'd ever uttered. He returned to his chair and resumed his watch. He sat through the long, dark hours as the fire burned down to glowing embers and the shadows grew long and deep, consuming the corners of the room. He was a sentinel, a lone guard at a forgotten outpost. The irony was bitter. He who had built this fortress to lock the world out was now standing guard to keep one small part of it safe within his walls. He was the jailer of his own loneliness, and now he had become the reluctant guardian of a prisoner of fate. He watched her breathe, the slow, shallow rhythm, a fragile anchor in the crushing silence of the Montana night, a sound that proved he was not, in fact, entirely alone. He had no way of knowing that his internal battle, as fierce as it was only a prelude. He couldn't know that far beyond the shelter of his cabin walls, under the cold, unblinking eyes of the stars, another force was on the move. Out there in the darkness, a group of riders pushed their horses through the deep snow, their progress relentless, their purpose absolute. Steam plumed from their horses' nostrils like smoke from a dragon's snout. The leader, a man named Silas Blackwood, rode with his face set in a mask of grim determination, his eyes scanning the snow for any sign. They were following a faint trail of footprints that the wind had not yet managed to erase. They were hunters, and their fury at their escaped quarry was a thing far colder and far more dangerous than the winter itself. Jed Thorne sat his lonely vigil, believing his greatest enemy was the memory of his past, utterly unaware that his future, armed and mounted, was riding toward him through the dark. Jed has made his choice, but he has no idea what's riding toward him through the dark. If you believe he did the right thing, comment number 2 and show your support by liking and sharing this video. Now, let's see what happens when she finally opens her eyes. Ilara woke slowly, dragged from the depths of a black, dreamless exhaustion. The first sensation was warmth, a foreign concept that her body struggled to process. It was a deep, penetrating heat that seemed to emanate from her very bones, pushing back the memory of the river's icy embrace. The second was the weight and rough texture of wool against her skin, heavy and unfamiliar. Her own clothes were gone. A flicker of panic, cold and sharp, cut through the comfortable haze. She opened her eyes. The world was shadow and firelight, and a man. He sat in a chair across the small room, a solid, unmoving silhouette against the flickering flames of the hearth. She didn't see his face clearly at first, only his shape, the broad set of his shoulders, the stillness of his posture. Then he shifted slightly, turning his head, and the firelight caught his eyes. They were the color of a winter sky just before a storm, a flat, unforgiving grey that held no warmth at all. They were the eyes of a man who had seen too much and felt too little, and in their depths she saw a geography of loss so vast it terrified her. The warmth vanished, replaced by a dread so profound it was like being plunged back into the frozen creek. A white man, a soldier. She knew it instantly, not from a uniform, but from the way he held himself. It was in the rigid set of his jaw, the hard economy of his movements, the constant, low-level vigilance that permeated the very air around him. He was a predator at rest. Her people had a name for men like him, men who wore the blue coat and carried the long rifles. They were the takers, the breakers, the ones who came with empty promises and left behind only graves and sorrow. Every story she had ever heard from the elders, every whispered warning from her mother, every fear she had ever known, coalesced into a single, paralyzing thought: I am in the monster's den. Her body reacted before her mind could. She shrank back, pulling the coarse blanket up to her chin like a shield, her muscles coiling tight as a snake ready to strike. She pressed herself against the cold log wall of the cabin, trying to make herself smaller, to disappear. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of terror. She waited for him to speak, to mock her, to name his price for saving her. She waited for the violence she knew was inevitable. But Jed said nothing. He watched her for a long moment, his grey eyes unreadable. Then, in a slow, deliberate motion, he stood up. He walked not toward her, but to the stove. He picked up the mug of broth he had placed there hours earlier, tested its warmth, and then set it back down on the small crate beside her cot. He did it all without a word, his movements measured and precise. Then he retreated, returning to his chair and picking up his Winchester. The act of him holding the rifle should have sent a fresh wave of terror through her. It was the instrument of her people's destruction, the symbol of his power. He began to clean it. He worked with an almost religious focus, breaking the weapon down into its component parts with practiced ease. The methodical click-clack of metal on metal filled the silence. He laid the pieces out on a worn piece of oilcloth, his hands moving with a surgeon's certainty. He didn't look at her. He didn't acknowledge her fear. He simply gave her space. He gave her the dignity of his silence. He didn't ask her name. He didn't ask where she came from. He didn't ask why a girl her age was trying to die in a frozen river. His silence was a wall, but she slowly began to realize it wasn't a wall meant to keep her out. It was a wall meant to protect her, to give her a space to breathe, to simply be, without the weight of questions she couldn't answer. It was the silence of a man who understood that some wounds were too deep for words. For hours, they existed in this strange, suspended reality. The girl, Ilara, did not move from the cot. The man, Jed, did not move from his task. The only movement was the dance of the flames and the slow, rhythmic motion of his hands polishing the barrel of his rifle until it gleamed dully in the firelight. She watched him. She stopped seeing a monster, a soldier, a white man. She started to see just a man. She saw the deep lines etched around his eyes. She saw the way his broad shoulders slumped ever so slightly when he thought she wasn't looking. She saw him pause to stare into the fire, his face unguarded for a fleeting moment, revealing a profound and desolate loneliness that resonated with her own. She saw him rise to place another log on the fire, his movements weary but steady. His quiet wasn't indifference. She understood that now. It was respect. He was treating her not as a savage, not as a woman, not as a prize, but as a wounded creature, deserving of a safe place to heal. The sun began to set, painting the small, grimy window of the cabin in hues of orange and purple. The day had passed, and with the fading light, a new awareness dawned: hunger. It was a gnawing, desperate ache in the pit of her stomach, a physical demand that could no longer be ignored. Her body, in its drive to survive, was betraying her fear. The mug of broth sat on the crate, steam still rising faintly from its surface. It was an offering, a test. To accept it was to accept his help, to place a fragile trust in the hands of a man she had every reason to hate. For another long moment, she fought the battle within herself. Fear against instinct, pride against need. Finally, instinct won. With a hand that trembled, she reached out from under the blanket. Her fingers brushed against the warm ceramic of the mug. The metallic clink of the spoon against the rim sounded like a gunshot in the still room. Jed stopped cleaning his rifle. The rhythmic motion ceased. He slowly raised his head, his grey eyes fixing on hers across the room. She held his gaze as she brought the mug to her lips. The broth was weak, but it was hot. The warmth spread through her chest, a slow, life-giving tide, chasing away the last of the river's chill. She took another sip, then another. She did not look away from him. The fear was still there, a coiled serpent in her gut, but it was no longer in control. When she lowered the mug, she gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. It was a gesture of thanks. It was an acknowledgement. It was the first bridge built across the chasm that separated them. Jed held her gaze for a second longer, and then he too gave a single curt nod in return. He turned his attention back to his rifle, the click-clack of metal resuming its steady rhythm. Nothing more was said, nothing more needed to be. In that silent exchange, something had shifted. Something had broken. It wasn't the silence of the room, but the ice that had encased two solitary, wounded souls for far too long. Ilara began to understand that this quiet, broken man, this enemy soldier, might not be the monster she had imagined. And Jed, for the first time in a decade, felt something stir in the barren landscape of his heart. It wasn't happiness, it wasn't hope. It was something far simpler and perhaps more powerful. It was the faint, flickering ember of purpose. But even as he felt it, the soldier in him whispered a cold truth. This fragile peace, this quiet moment in a warm cabin, was a lie. It was a temporary truce in a war that was still raging. The world outside the door had not gone away. It was still out there, waiting, and it would not be as kind as his silence. A fragile truce has been formed in silence. Do you think this quiet man can truly protect her? Let us know by commenting number 3. The quiet is about to be shattered, and the truth of why she was in that river is about to come knocking. The next few days passed in a slow, strange rhythm that felt almost like peace. A fragile truce settled over the small cabin, a pocket of warmth and quiet carved out of the heart of the brutal winter. Ilara slowly regained her strength. She began to move about the cabin, her steps at first unsteady, like a newborn foal finding its legs, but growing stronger with each passing hour. She remained silent, a ghost in his home, but her presence transformed the space. The crushing weight of Jed's solitude, a presence so thick he could almost taste it, began to recede. The cabin no longer felt like a tomb, but a shelter. Their communication was a language without words. One afternoon he found her sitting by the fire, mending a tear in his worn canvas shirt with a bone needle and thread she had fashioned from a loose sinew on her own tattered dress. Her fingers moved with a deftness and precision that surprised him. It was an act of quiet reciprocity, a gesture that spoke volumes more than any conversation could. In return, Jed took to leaving food for her on the rough-hewn table, a piece of smoked venison, a handful of dried berries he'd foraged in the fall. He never watched her eat, but the food was always gone when he returned. They were two solitary planets, orbiting the same small fire, building a delicate bridge of unspoken understanding across a chasm of silence and history. He started to forget she was a native. She started to forget he was a soldier. They were just two people, surviving. But peace in these mountains is an illusion, a thin sheet of ice over a raging river, and the ice was about to break. It happened late one afternoon. The sky was the color of a fresh bruise, promising more snow. A sound cut through the stillness, the frantic barking of a dog from somewhere down the valley. It was a sound of alarm. Jed was on his feet in an instant, his body reacting with the ingrained instinct of a man who knew the difference between the bark of a hunting dog and the bark of a warning. He snatched his Winchester from its place by the door. With a sharp, silent gesture, he motioned for Ilara to stay back, away from the single, grimy window. He peered through a small crack in the log wall. A lone figure on horseback was approaching, moving slowly up the trail that led to his cabin. Jed's muscles tensed. He didn't get visitors, ever. As the rider drew closer, Jed recognized the stooped shoulders and the grizzled beard. It was Elias Thorne, a weathered old trapper who lived a few miles down the creek. Elias was the closest thing Jed had to a neighbor, which meant they might exchange a curt nod once or twice a year if their paths crossed at the river. They weren't friends. Jed didn't have friends. But Elias was a man who minded his own business, a quality Jed respected. For him to ride all the way up here meant something was wrong. Elias reined in his horse a good 50 yards from the cabin, a respectful distance. His face, chapped and reddened by the wind, was etched with worry. "Jed," he called out, his voice a gravelly rasp carried on the wind. "Jed, you in there?" Jed opened the door a crack, his body still shielding the interior. The cold air hit him like a fist. "Elias," he grunted, his tone flat, discouraging conversation. "Came to warn you," the old trapper said, wasting no time. He leaned forward in his saddle, his voice dropping lower. "There's men scouring the valley, Silas Blackwood and his hired guns. Rode past my place this morning, angry as a nest of hornets." Jed's blood ran cold. The name hit him like a physical blow. Silas Blackwood. He knew the name. Everyone did. Blackwood owned the biggest ranch in the territory, a sprawling empire built on ruthless ambition and cheap land deals. He was a man who took what he wanted, a man whose smile never reached his cold, dead eyes. He treated the local tribes with a contempt that bordered on genocidal. "They're looking for someone," Elias continued, his eyes darting toward Jed's cabin. "Say a native girl run off on him. A runaway bride, they're calling her, promised to him by her father." Jed's gaze flickered back into the shadows of the cabin. He saw a shape move. Ilara. She was standing just out of sight, listening. He could feel her fear like a palpable thing, a cold draft seeping into the room. It all clicked into place. The frozen creek, the torn dress, the terror in her eyes when she first woke. This was what she was running from. "They're putting it about that she stole something from him," Elias spat, a wad of tobacco juice staining the snow. "A horse, jewelry, a lie, of course. We both know what this is about. It's about his pride. He won't stop till he finds her, Jed, and God help anyone who gets in his way." The old trapper's eyes locked onto Jed's, his meaning clear and sharp as a skinning knife. "You ain't seen no one passing through, have you? A young girl, alone." Jed's throat went dry. Here it was. The crossroads, the moment of choice. The soldier in his head screamed at him, "Lie, tell him no, send him on his way, buy yourself time. This is not your fight." It was the smart thing to do, the safe thing. One word, and Elias would be gone, and Blackwood would be none the wiser. But as Jed looked into the old trapper's weary, concerned eyes, the lie caught in his throat. He thought of the girl inside, of the trust she had placed in him with that first, hesitant sip of broth. He couldn't do it. He couldn't be that man anymore. "She's here," Jed said. The words came out low and steady, each one a stone, dropping into a deep well. "Hurt. Starving when I found her." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the whistling of the wind. Elias stared at him for a long moment, then shook his head, a slow, sad gesture of resignation. "You're signing your own death warrant, son," he said, his voice laced with a grim finality. "Silas Blackwood ain't a man who listens to reason. He listens to gunpowder." The old trapper gathered his reins. "I ain't seen a thing," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "My memory ain't what it used to be. But that won't buy you much. He'll find his way here eventually. You ain't got much time." Without another word, Elias turned his horse and rode back down the trail, a lonely figure swallowed by the vast, indifferent wilderness. Jed closed the door and turned. Ilara was standing in the center of the room, her face a pale mask of anguish. Tears welled in her dark eyes, tracing clean paths through the faint grime on her cheeks. Her silence was finally broken. "Silas," she whispered, her voice a shattered, broken thing, barely audible. The name hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken menace. That one word was all the confirmation he needed. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that there was no turning back. He hadn't just saved a stranger, he had stepped into her story, he had chosen a side. And as the last of the daylight bled from the sky and the wind began to howl through the cracks in the log walls like a keening mourner, he heard it, faint at first, then growing steadily stronger. A new sound, carried on the wind, the rhythmic, menacing beat of approaching hoofbeats. They were coming. The enemy is at the door. Jed has chosen his side, but is it a fight he can possibly win? If you're on the edge of your seat, comment number 4, and don't forget to like and subscribe so you never miss a moment of the action. What happens next will change everything. The hoofbeats grew closer, no longer a faint rhythm on the edge of hearing, but a heavy, grinding sound that seemed to chew up the silence and spit it out. It was the sound of an approaching verdict, the inexorable, earth-shaking heartbeat of a malevolent will. Jed moved with the cold, fluid economy he had learned was the only true currency in a firefight. He checked the action on his Winchester, the familiar metallic rasp, a grim comfort. He thumbed a fresh, brass-cased cartridge into the chamber, the motion as natural to him as breathing. He placed a small, neat pyramid of 6 extra rounds on the table beside him, an offering to the god of violence. Each motion was precise, stripped of all wasted energy, a ritual of preparation he had performed more times than he could count. His face was a granite mask, his mind focused into a single, sharp point of lethal purpose. He was ready. He had been born for this kind of brutal arithmetic. But when he turned from the table, the sight that met him stopped him cold. The girl was no longer huddled in the corner, a frightened creature waiting for the storm to pass. The timid, broken child he had pulled from the river, the one with eyes as wide and terrified as a cornered doe, was gone. In her place stood a young woman. The fear was still there, he could see it flickering in the dark, fathomless depths of her eyes, but it was no longer her master. It was now a fuel. A pilot light of pure, unadulterated defiance had been ignited within her, and it now burned with the righteous intensity of a forge fire. She had straightened to her full height, her shoulders squared, her chin lifted. The transformation was so sudden, so complete, it was as if the approaching thunder had burned away the fog of her despair and left only forged steel in its place. She walked toward him, her bare feet silent on the rough floorboards. She closed the space between them until she stood just an arm's length away, forcing him to meet her gaze. "They will not stop," she said. Her voice, once a shattered whisper lost in the cabin's silence, was now clear and steady, laced with a certainty that chilled him more than the winter wind. "You must understand this. Silas does not see a person when he looks at me. My father traded me for 10 horses and 5 barrels of whiskey." To Silas, I am no different from the cattle in his fields, an object that bears his brand. His honor is tied to his possessions. He cannot lose one. He will not leave without me, or without your blood staining the snow as payment for sheltering what is his." Jed was stunned, thrown off balance more than any physical blow could have. He had expected tears, pleading, the panicked terror he had seen so many times before in the face of imminent violence. He had not expected this. This analysis, this cold, hard clarity, this strength. The imminent arrival of her tormentor hadn't broken her, it had tempered her. In that moment, she ceased to be a helpless victim. He was protecting out of some buried shred of decency. She became an ally, a strategist. "You need to run," Jed said, his voice a low growl, rough and pragmatic. It was the only tactical solution his soldier's mind could produce. "The back window is small, but you can fit. Go. Get into the trees. It'll be dark soon. I can hold them off, give you a head start." It was a lie, he knew. He was one man against at least 4 or 5. He couldn't hold them off for long, but he could buy her minutes. Maybe that would be enough for a life. Ilara shook her head, a single, sharp gesture of absolute refusal. The fire in her eyes blazed hotter. "No," she said, the word not pleaded but commanded. "I have been running my whole life. I ran from my father's choices. I ran from Silas's cruelty. My last run took me to that river, to the peace of the ice." She glanced toward the cot where she had lain, a flicker of memory crossing her face. "You pulled me from that water. For what? So I could run again, and die of freezing in the snow instead of the river? It is the same death, a death of fear." She took a breath. "My running ends here, in this room, with you. If I am to die, I will die standing, not crawling." Her gaze swept the small cabin, landing on the heavy skinning knife he kept honed to a razor's edge, resting on the stone mantelpiece. Before he could form a protest, she moved past him, her motion swift and certain. She picked it up. The heavy stag-bone handle was too large for her slender fingers, dwarfing her grip, but she held it with a white-knuckled intensity, the long, curved blade pointed downward at her side. She was not a warrior. She did not know how to use the weapon, but that didn't matter. The act of holding it was a declaration, a choice made manifest in cold steel. Jed stared at her, a strange, unfamiliar feeling rising in his chest. It was a sensation he hadn't felt in years, a ghost of something he thought had died on a forgotten battlefield alongside his youth. It was awe. He was a man accustomed to fighting alone, to trusting no one but himself and the cold, reliable mechanics of his rifle. He had built his entire existence around that solitary, bitter principle. But now, in this cramped, dark cabin at what felt like the edge of the world, he was not alone. The girl whose life he had saved by instinct was now standing beside him, choosing to face certain death rather than abandon him to a fight that was hers. The hoofbeats stopped directly outside. The sudden, suffocating silence that followed was thick with menace. "Listen to me," Ilara said quickly, her voice dropping to an urgent, tactical whisper. "Silas is a proud man, a vain man. He will not start shooting immediately. That is not his way. He will want to talk first. He will want to gloat, to posture, to show his power, to make you feel small before he kills you." Her eyes bored into his, conveying the desperate importance of her words. "Do not let him anger you. That is his trap. He will provoke you. He will insult you, call you old and broken. He will call me a whore. He will say anything to make your blood boil. He needs your anger to justify his violence. He needs to be able to tell the story later that you were the aggressor, that you fired first. Do not give him that satisfaction." Jed looked at her, truly looked at her, and he no longer saw the fragile girl he had rescued. He saw a survivor. He saw a tactician who understood the psychology of her enemy better than any general. She had taken the currency of her own pain and powerlessness and somehow, impossibly, minted it into wisdom. She was trying to save him now, just as he had saved her. A thunderous blow struck the door, a solid, percussive impact that wasn't a knock but an assault, shaking the whole frame and sending a small shower of dust down from the rafters. "Jedediah Thorne," a voice boomed from outside, dripping with arrogant authority and the promise of violence. It was the voice of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "I know you're in there, you old hermit. Open this door. You are harboring something that belongs to me." Ilara gripped the handle of the knife tighter, her knuckles bone white. She looked at Jed one last time, a silent, powerful understanding passing between them. In that moment, she had not only found her voice, she had found her will to fight. And as Jed turned and took a slow, deliberate step toward the door, he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his marrow, that he was no longer fighting for her. He was fighting with her. Jed looked at her, truly looked at her, and he no longer saw the fragile girl he had rescued. He saw a survivor. He saw a strategist. She had taken the currency of her own pain and powerlessness and somehow, impossibly, minted it into wisdom. She was trying to save him now, just as he had saved her. A thunderous bang on the door shook the entire cabin. "Jedediah Thorne," a voice boomed from outside. It was a voice full of arrogant authority, the voice of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "I know you're in there, you old hermit. Open this door. You are harboring something that belongs to me." Ilara gripped the handle of the knife tighter, her knuckles bone white. She looked at Jed one last time, a silent understanding passing between them. In that moment, she had not only found her voice, she had found her will to fight. And as Jed turned and took a slow, deliberate step toward the door, he knew with a certainty that settled deep in his marrow that he was no longer fighting for her. He was fighting with her. The girl has found her voice and her courage. She's no longer a victim, but a warrior. If her transformation gave you chills, comment number 5. Now, let's see how Silas Blackwood reacts when he finds that his property has a will of its own. Jed pulled the heavy wooden bar from the door. The protest of the groaning wood was the only sound. He didn't throw the door open. He eased it back just a few inches, a narrow slit of frigid air and harsh reality. He kept his body behind the solid oak, the Winchester held low at his side but ready. The sliver of a view was all he needed. Silas Blackwood sat astride a massive black stallion that was as ill-tempered and powerful as its owner. The horse pawed restlessly at the snow, its breath pluming in the biting cold. Blackwood himself was a portrait of arrogant authority. He wore a thick wolf-pelt coat that made his shoulders seem unnaturally broad, and his face, flush with a combination of the cold and simmering rage, was framed by a meticulously trimmed black beard. He looked less like a rancher and more like a feudal lord surveying his domain. Behind him, fanned out in a loose semicircle, were his 4 hired men. They were a hard-looking bunch, their faces impassive and cruel, each man with a rifle held loosely across his saddle or a holstered pistol sitting high on his hip. They were wolves, and Blackwood was their alpha. "Thorne," Silas began, his voice a low growl that carried easily in the still air. A cruel smirk twisted his lips, a slash of humorless amusement in the dark bristle of his beard. "Enough of this foolishness. I know the little whore is in there with you. My trackers are the best in this territory. Send her out, and I might just let you keep living in this pigsty." He gestured dismissively at the cabin, his gaze sweeping over it with unconcealed contempt. Jed said nothing. He simply stood there, a silent, immovable object in the doorway. He let the man's words hang in the air and die, frozen by the cold and by his own stony silence. His lack of response, his refusal to even acknowledge the man's authority, was a greater insult than any shouted defiance. He was a rock, and Blackwood's threats were just water, splashing uselessly against him. He remembered Ilara's warning, "He will provoke you." He could feel the anger, a familiar hot coal in his gut, but he banked it, kept it hidden deep inside. Blackwood's smirk faltered, his face tightening with irritation. The silence was unnerving him, robbing him of his script. "What's the matter, old man? Did the war freeze your tongue?" One of his men sneered, a younger man with mean, close-set eyes. Finally, Jed spoke. His voice, when it came, was not loud, but it had a weight and a resonance that cut through the sharp wind. It was the voice of a man who did not waste words. "She is not property," he said, each word spaced with deliberate calm. "She is a human being, and she is staying here." The statement was so simple, so direct, it seemed to catch Blackwood by surprise. For a moment, he just stared. Then, he threw his head back and laughed. A harsh, ugly sound that had no joy in it. "A human being?" he mocked, his laughter subsiding into a sneer. "That's a good one, Thorn. She's a red savage, and her father, a drunken chief, sold her to me for 10 prime horses and 5 barrels of my best whiskey. She is my chattel by the laws of God and man." He patted the polished walnut grip of the Colt revolver strapped to his hip, a gesture that was both a promise and a threat. "And I always collect what is mine." It was then that Ilara moved. Before Jed could stop her, she stepped forward from the shadows behind him, appearing in the sliver of open doorway at his side. She was no longer hiding. Her face was pale, but her eyes burned, with a fire that seemed to generate its own heat. She held the skinning knife at her side, her knuckles white, but her gaze was locked on Blackwood. "I am not yours, Silas," she said, and her voice, though not loud, rang with a surprising strength that silenced the men behind him. It was the voice he'd heard for the first time only moments before, a voice she had just discovered she owned. "I belong to no one, and I would have sooner given my body to the river than to your bed." The public defiance from the girl he considered little more than livestock stunned Blackwood into a momentary silence. His face, already flushed, darkened to a deep, dangerous purple. The veins on his temples stood out like thick cords. "You ungrateful little bitch," he roared, his carefully constructed composure shattering completely. "After all I've done for your pathetic, starving tribe." He ripped the heavy Colt from its holster, the metallic rasp an ugly, final sound. The barrel leveled, pointing not at Ilara, but directly at Jed's chest. "Thorn, this is your last chance. Step aside." Jed didn't move an inch. He didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. He simply brought the Winchester up slightly, the stock settling against his hip, the barrel angled toward the ground but ready to rise in a heartbeat. It was a subtle shift, a quiet answer that was as clear as a gunshot. It said, "You will have to go through me." The confrontation had reached its final, irrevocable point. The time for words, for threats and posturing was over. This was no longer a negotiation. It was a collision of two worlds, distilled into a single frozen moment outside a lonely cabin in the Montana wilderness. It was the world of Silas Blackwood, a world where power was the only currency and people were possessions to be bought and sold. And it was the world of Jedediah Thorn, a world he was only just rediscovering, a world where a human life, even one he barely knew, was worth defending. "Then you'll die with her," Silas hissed, his face a mask of pure, murderous rage. He cocked the hammer on the Colt, the sharp, metallic click, an obscene punctuation mark in the heavy silence. In that fraction of a second, as Silas's finger whitened on the trigger, time seemed to stretch and thin. Jed's mind did not go to the war. It did not go to the faces of the men he had killed or the ghosts that haunted his sleep. His past, for once, was silent. His mind was filled with a single, clear image, the face of the girl standing behind him. The girl who had looked him in the eye and refused to run. The girl who had reminded him, with her quiet strength and defiant voice, that some things were still worth fighting for, that a man's soul wasn't lost until he willing to let it go. And as the first orange blossom of flame erupted from the barrel of Blackwood's pistol, tearing the winter quiet to shreds, Jed was ready. The line has been drawn, the guns are out, it's one man and a girl against a small army. Who do you think will be left standing? Comment number 6 to cast your vote. And if you love stories of courage against all odds, please like, share and subscribe to support our channel. The battle for the cabin begins now. Blackwood's shot roared, but Jed was already moving. He was a creature of instinct, his body reacting a fraction of a second before the conscious thought could form. He didn't duck or flinch. He simply moved backward, pulling Ilara with him in a single fluid motion. The lead ball slammed into the thick oak doorframe where his chest had been a moment before, showering the interior with splinters of wood. He kicked the door shut, the heavy bar thudding back into its iron brackets just as a deafening volley of gunfire erupted from outside. The cabin walls shuddered as bullets tore through the seasoned logs, a deadly hail of lead ripping through the fragile peace. The war had come to his doorstep. Inside, the soldier took over. The years of drilling, the muscle memory honed in the crucible of battle, stripped away all fear, all hesitation. There was only the cold, clear geometry of survival. "Down!" he commanded, his voice a hard, sharp bark. He didn't push Ilara gently, he shoved her toward the floor, toward the relative safety of the low-slung cot. He didn't wait to see if she obeyed. He moved, low and fast, to the small window at the side of the cabin. He peered out for a split second, taking in the scene, one man reloading behind the woodpile, another moving to flank the cabin. He raised the Winchester, lined up the sights, and fired. The rifle's report was a satisfying, solid crack inside the small space. Outside, a man cried out and staggered back, clutching his shoulder, seeking cover behind a thick pine. This was a world Jed understood. The chaos, the acrid smell of gunpowder smoke burning in his nostrils, the thunder of weapons, the frantic calculus of life and death measured in seconds. It was a terrible, familiar symphony. But something was different this time. He wasn't fighting for a flag he no longer believed in. He wasn't fighting for an officer's order. He wasn't fighting to take ground or to push an enemy back. He was fighting to keep one single heartbeat going in the room behind him. He was fighting for a life. The startling clarity of that purpose sharpened his senses, focused his will into a singular, unwavering point. He was not, however, fighting alone. Ilara didn't just cower under the cot. Lying on the floor, her cheek pressed against the rough, dusty floorboards, she saw the world from a different angle. Through the small gaps between the logs near the foundation, she could see the legs and boots of their attackers. She saw a pair of worn leather boots moving stealthily toward the right side of the cabin, toward a blind spot. "There is one to the right," she yelled, her voice cutting through the din of the gunfire. "By the woodpile, he's moving." Jed didn't need to look. He didn't question her. He trusted her. He pivoted, aimed the Winchester at the log wall where she had indicated, and fired blind. The heavy-caliber round punched straight through the wood. A strangled scream of pain and surprise answered him from outside, followed by a string of curses. One less gun to worry about. The fight raged. It was a brutal, unequal contest, 5 guns against 1. But Jed had the advantage of cover, a fortress, however ramshackle. He moved from the window to the door, firing sparingly, making every shot count, a phantom of vengeance in his own home. He was a ghost, and this was his graveyard. The air grew thick with smoke. But then the tide turned. As Jed was reloading, shoving fresh cartridges into the Winchester with practiced speed, a crash of breaking glass and splintering wood came from the back of the cabin. One of Blackwood's men, the mean-eyed youth, had circled around and kicked in the small rear window. He tumbled into the room, a long, gleaming Bowie knife in his hand, his face a mask of savage intent. Jed was caught off guard, his rifle empty, his body turned away. He had no time to react. But Ilara did. With a cry that was more fury than fear, she launched herself from under the cot. She didn't have her knife. She grabbed the first thing she could reach, a heavy piece of firewood from the hearth, one end still glowing with a bright orange ember. She swung it with all her might, a desperate two-handed blow that connected with the side of the intruder's head. The man roared in pain and shock, stumbling back, his hand flying to his face where the glowing ember had seared his skin. That single, desperate act of courage bought Jed the 2 seconds he needed. He dropped the useless rifle, drew the heavy dragoon pistol he carried, tucked in his belt as a last resort, and fired. The close-range blast was deafening, filling the small cabin with a cloud of black smoke. The man with the knife collapsed to the floor and did not move again. Jed stood there, panting, the heavy pistol smoking in his hand. He looked at the man on the floor. He looked at Ilara. She was standing over the body, her chest heaving, the piece of firewood still gripped in her hands. Her face was smudged with soot, her eyes wide and blazing with a fire that seemed to scorch the very air. And in that instant, a memory, sharp and brutal, slammed into Jed with the force of a physical blow. A different battle, a different lifetime, a dusty street in a nameless village. He saw a woman and a child, trapped in a doorway, caught between his advancing line and the enemy's. He could have stopped. He could have provided covering fire, pulled them to safety. But his lieutenant had screamed at him to keep moving, to maintain the advance. So he had. He had followed his orders. He had lowered his eyes and kept marching, leaving them to their fate. He never knew what happened to them, but their faces, wide with a terror that looked just like Ilara's, had become the cornerstone of the fortress of guilt he had built around his soul. Now, here he was again, at a crossroads, a second chance offered up in smoke and blood. He looked at the dead man on his floor, a man he had just killed to protect her. He looked at Ilara, trembling but resolute, a warrior in her own right. And a profound, soul-shattering realization washed over him. This was not a fight against Silas Blackwood. This was a reckoning. This was a battle against the ghost of the man who followed orders, the man who walked away. He had to win, not just to live, but to be redeemed. A raw, inhuman sound tore from Jed's throat, a roar of grief and rage and newfound purpose. He was no longer a soldier following orders. He was no longer a ghost running from his past. With the smoking pistol in one hand, he snatched his reloaded rifle with the other and kicked the door open, launching himself out into the snow and the gunfire. He was a protector. He was a man taking back his own soul, one bullet at a time. Jed has just faced his own demons in a storm of gunfire. He's no longer a ghost, but a protector. If that incredible stand had your heart pounding, show some love by commenting. Number 7. The fighting is over, but the story isn't. Stay with us for the powerful conclusion. The dawn came, not with a triumphant burst of light, but with a slow, quiet bleeding of grey into the eastern sky. It brought with it a silence that was more profound than any noise. The battle was over. When Jed had charged out of the cabin, a man possessed by a righteous fury he hadn't felt in decades, the fight had changed. It was no longer a siege, it was a rout. Faced with a demon of vengeance instead of a tired old hermit, Silas Blackwood and his 2 remaining men had lost their nerve. They had fled, leaving their fallen comrades behind in the trampled, blood-stained snow. They had come for a girl they saw as property and had been met by a man defending a principle, and it had broken them. Inside the cabin, the air was thick, a foul mixture of sweat, fear, and the lingering metallic stench of gunpowder. It was the air of an abattoir. The fire in the hearth had died down to a bed of sullen, red embers. Jed sat on the floor, his back propped against the log wall, his legs stretched out in front of him. The adrenaline had drained away, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion that was almost crippling. A long, shallow gash along his left forearm, where a bullet had grazed him, wept a slow, steady trickle of blood onto the floorboards. Ilara knelt beside him. Without a word, she took the hem of her tattered deerskin dress, the one he had pulled from the river, the one she had painstakingly mended, and tore a long, clean strip from it. Her movements were gentle now, her earlier ferocity replaced by a quiet, focused care. She dipped the cloth into the water bucket, the water now clouded with soot and debris, and began to clean the wound. They did not speak. There was nothing to say. Words were useless, inadequate things in the face of what they had just shared. The silence between them was no longer a chasm of fear and mistrust. It was a shared space, a sanctuary forged in violence. They had faced death together, had stared into the abyss side by side, and had somehow, impossibly, climbed back out. That bond was deeper, stronger than any words could ever express. She finished cleaning the wound and wrapped the strip of deerskin tightly around his arm, fashioning a crude but effective bandage. Her touch was light, her fingers sure. When she was done, she didn't move away. She sat back on her heels, then slowly sank to the floor to sit beside him, her shoulder almost touching his. She looked at his face, at the grim lines of exhaustion, the smudges of gunpowder on his cheek, and for the first time she saw all of him. Not the soldier, not the stranger, not the white man. She saw Jedediah Thorne, the man who had pulled her from the ice and then stood between her and the hell that had followed. The man who had fought for her. Jed stared down at his own hands, resting on his knees. They were large, calloused, and scarred. They were the hands of a killer. He could still feel the phantom kick of the rifle, the heavy recoil of the pistol. He had taken life again tonight. But as he looked at them, he realized they had done more than just kill, they had protected. And for the first time since the war, the morning after a battle did not bring with it the familiar, hollow emptiness. There was no elation in victory, only a profound weariness. But beneath it, small and fragile but undeniably present, was a flicker of something he had long ago given up on. It felt like hope. "Thank you," Ilara whispered, her voice barely a breath, but it was enough to break the spell. Jed turned his head to look at her. He couldn't remember the last time someone had thanked him for anything. He simply nodded, his throat too tight to speak. After a moment, he managed to find his own voice, a rough, gravelly sound. "You saved my life," he said. It was a simple statement of fact. The man with the knife, he would have been too late. They sat in silence as the first true rays of the sun streamed through the broken window, painting a long golden rectangle on the floor, illuminating the floating dust motes and the lingering haze of smoke. The scene outside was one of carnage and ruin, but inside the cabin, a new kind of quiet had been born, a peace. Jed knew the past would never be erased. The ghosts would not simply vanish. The scars on his soul were permanent. But as he sat there, with the warmth of the young woman beside him a silent testament to the choice he had made, he realized something profound. The scars weren't hurting anymore. He knew she wouldn't be leaving. There was no talk of her returning to her people, or of him taking her to a fort. Those were ideas from a different world, a different lifetime. This cabin, once his fortress of solitude, his self-imposed prison, had become their sanctuary. There was no future planned, no promises made between them. There was only the present, this quiet dawn, a moment of peace purchased with blood and courage. Jedediah Thorne, the lonely man who had gone to the mountains to die, had saved a dying girl. And in doing so, without knowing it, without intending it, he had found that she was the one who had pulled him from the wreckage of his own broken soul. Redemption, he now understood, wasn't found in a church or at the bottom of a bottle. It wasn't granted by a forgiving God. It was earned. It was earned in the quiet, steadfast presence of another human being who had seen the monster inside you and had chosen, against all reason, not to run away. 2 broken souls have found a quiet dawn. If this story of redemption touched your heart, let us know by commenting. Number 8. Your support means the world to us. Hit that subscribe button because we have so many more incredible tales from the Old West waiting for you. You know, after a story like that, it doesn't just end when the narrator stops talking, does it? It lingers. The quiet of that final dawn in the cabin, the unspoken understanding between Jed and Ilara, it stays with you. And for me, sitting with that feeling, I realize this story isn't just a tale about the Old West. It's a story about the fortresses we build inside ourselves. We all have a version of Jed's cabin. It's that place we retreat to when the world has hurt us, or when we've hurt ourselves. It's the solitude we wrap around ourselves like a thick wool blanket, hoping to numb the ghosts of our past, the mistakes we've made, the people we've failed, the times we didn't act when we should have. We tell ourselves this isolation is strength, that it's safer to feel nothing than to risk feeling pain again. But Jed's story shows us the truth. That kind of fortress is also a prison. It doesn't heal the wounds. It just lets them fester in the dark. And then, life presents us with a frozen hand. It's that unexpected moment that demands a choice. It's usually not dramatic. It's a friend calling in crisis when you're tired. It's an opportunity to speak up for someone when it would be easier to stay silent. It's a chance to offer a small kindness to a stranger. It's our chance to step out of the cabin and into the cold water. And Jed's story teaches us that our redemption, our path back to feeling human, doesn't begin with some grand gesture. It begins with that one simple, instinctual choice to act with decency. His strength, his skill with a rifle, his entire capacity for survival was meaningless until he used it for someone other than himself. His purpose wasn't found in hiding from the world. It was found the moment he chose to engage with it. Then there's Ilara, and her lesson is just as powerful. She reminds us that courage isn't the absence of fear. She was terrified, but she found her voice not when she was safe, but when she was most threatened. She took a lifetime of being treated as property and transformed it into the will to stand and fight. How many of us stay silent, silenced by the fear of what others will think, of conflict, of failure? Ilara shows us that our true strength isn't discovered in comfort, it's forged in the fire. It's found when we decide that our voice, our dignity, is worth more than our safety. Ultimately, they didn't magically fix each other. Jed didn't erase her trauma, and she didn't absolve him of his sins. What they did was create a space where healing could begin. He offered her a moment of safety, and in return she offered him a reason to fight. It's a powerful reminder that we can't outrun our past, but we can decide who we are going to be today. And sometimes the greatest act of courage isn't riding into battle, but simply having the courage to reach out and pull someone from the cold. What did this story make you feel? Every one of us hears something different, a lesson that speaks directly to our own life. I'd love to know what you took away from it. Share your lesson in the comments below. Let's talk about it. And if these stories resonate with you, please subscribe and join our community. Your support allows us to keep these incredible tales alive.